Thank you, everybody, for attending today's webinar on how cognitive biases lead to investment mistakes. On a quarterly basis, we come out with an explorations, and in that explorations and then the associated webinar, we look to go really deep on a theme or topic that affects long-term investing. We're long-term investors on behalf of our constituents, you the clients, and for those advisors on. And this quarter, we really focused on cognitive biases, which could have a dramatically deleterious effect on returns. And so today's topic, I think, is a really interesting one. There's, to my understanding, 188 cognitive biases. We have with us a special guest, Dr. Brooke Struck from the from the Decision Lab. He's the research director at the Decision Lab to help us have this conversation around how cognitive biases lead to investment mistakes. So really excited to have you on, Brooke. And if you don't mind, kick it off maybe with explaining to us what exactly the Decision Lab does and a little bit of your background, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me today. Happy to be chatting with all of you. So the Decision Lab is a boutique consulting firm. We're located in Montreal, up in Canada, and essentially what we do is we conduct research into the biases and heuristics that affect decision making at various points along different decision journeys. We do a lot of work in the financial decision making space, the personal finance space. So thinking exactly about how it is that people make investment decisions, how it is that they decide how much they're going to save, what it is that keeps them from reaching their savings goals, how it is that people struggle to avoid spending money on things that they know they shouldn't be spending money on, but still find themselves doing it anyway. So that's the type of work that we're doing. Some of the bigger name clients that we've worked with include Capital One. We've worked with them down in the States, as well as up here in Canada. Working with them, we've done a lot of work on the effects of stress on financial decision making, and different strategies that people can use to alleviate the effects of stress and make better decisions with their money. We've also worked quite a bit with FP Canada, which is the group that certifies the certified financial planners up here in Canada. We helped them to overhaul their entire curriculum the last time that they did that, which I think was launched at the beginning of 2020. We wrote an entire kind of behavioral portion to help guide financial planners through the behavioral pitfalls that they might encounter in working with clients through the 7 stages of financial planning. We've worked with the Ontario Securities Commission, this kind of thing. Anyway, I don't want to prattle on too much there. In terms of my own background, my PhD is actually in philosophy of science. And so I'm really interested in how it is that we combine pieces of evidence into something that we call objectivity, and then use that objective thing as a basis for making decisions. So I've worked quite a bit in evidence-based policy and thought a lot about how institutions make decisions, and then kind of shifted to individual level decision making. And that's what got me into behavioral science and decision science, and eventually finding my way here to the Decision Lab.
That's great, Brooke. Thank you for that. We're going to start really hot here. We're going to get right into one of the items you mentioned that you focused on is how people make investment decisions, and then commented on maybe some of the biases that go into that. Robinhood. Let's discuss Robinhood for a moment, because on the one side you have, historically, there's probably always been some effect of what people see in the news and the whole bit, but people went about making certain investment decisions for a variety of reasons. But now you have Robinhood, and the SEC, to my understanding, is looking into, okay, what's a nudge, right? And how does that work? And so I'm going to throw it over to you, but one thing I want to just within Robinhood, right, you have these algos, right? And it's an open secret. We're not the ones, me and you didn't come up with, there's 188 cognitive biases, like everybody knows about it. And now it seems like companies and algos, while they have all these great benefits in terms of standardization and keeping processes consistent, there's this downside. So maybe we could go right into talking about algos, the good and bad too, as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that algorithms are a really interesting thing. Essentially what they produce much better than human decision-making systems is consistency. But what it is that they consistently produce is entirely down to the design of how the algorithm is built and what kind of outcome you set as the goal for a machine learning process or a neural network process to actually optimize for in the way that it's learning from a data set. And so what we've seen, I mean, let's go a little bit broader than Robinhood for just a second, right? Like if we think about the way that social media platforms such as Facebook and others have been discussed in the news in the last few years, we realize that not all of the goals that we might set for an algorithm are necessarily to the broad-based advantage of society. And bringing that more into the local context of Robinhood, like you have to think about where people's financial advantages lie and where organizations' financial advantages lie in terms of trying to figure out what it is those algorithms are actually optimizing for. In the case of Robinhood, they benefit enormously from bulk trading. So they have every advantage in the world, and in fact use their algorithms to promote people just trading more. Now, of course, they want to help people to be trading better to the extent that they can, but like trading more is what gets Robinhood more money. So they will be consistently pushing people in that direction. So they've used a lot of things, gamification features that are well known in the behavioral science world that are in some senses similar to gambling, like making you feel like you've really kind of won the lottery when you participate in certain kinds of behaviors within the app, which has like very well known and well documented effects in terms of the way that dopamine is released in the brain. Like essentially what one can create with this kind of thing is a physical dependence on trading.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And we've spoken in the past on some of our commentaries, I think probably around GameStop earlier in the year, when that kind of, and it's amazing because GameStop's still at those, that people don't pay attention to it, still at a really, really, I don't want to call it a high valuation because maybe it's a correct valuation, but relative to the valuation it was about a year ago, it's maybe a 20x. But one of the items we spoke about, which you, Brooke, commented on, is who the client really is, right? Yeah. And what Robinhood has to do, right? They make most of a vast majority of the revenue that Robinhood makes is from selling order flow. And so, as you correctly mentioned, it's really important for Robinhood to create order flow. And then there's probably some second degree of importance to make sure those people who are providing order flow are actually happy, right? And then you get some of that gamification, but you want to maximize the order flow and then try after that. That's first order, I think. And then second order is try to make sure everybody continues to play. And I guess I want to take it, there's this element of free, and I think that's what we hit on a little, that there's all these, everything's free nowadays and people don't like it, right? So if you think about a transactional cost, anything you do on Robinhood is zero. The vast majority of our clients are on TD. TD had to follow suit, and they made a lot of things zero. Yeah, but they're not, so I'd love to have that conversation around like the biases that affect, right? A lot of times people are like, yeah, I'll take zero over $1, and they won't go through the math, right? Maybe it's too complex. I don't know. What's your thought? So yeah, for sure. There's this old adage, like if you can't figure out what the product is, you are the product. And that is more true now in our age of everything free on the internet than it's ever been before, right? And so for sure, there are these kind of first order effects of like, what is it that actually makes the company money? Because that's going to be pretty dominant in the way that they're mixing the secret sauce of whatever those algorithms are doing behind the scenes. And there have been some interesting departures from that. So the name of the platform escapes me right now, but there was a dating app that explicitly came out with the idea that the end goal for a dating app should be that you find somebody that you're happy with and therefore no longer need a dating app. So they had kind of baked that into their algorithm. It's like, we want to optimize people kind of exiting the platform after a certain duration, because if they're not doing that, then it's a sign that the platform isn't achieving what it's supposed to achieve, which I thought was really cool. And it was obviously a breath of fresh air in terms of how people are conceptualizing the way that apps are designed and the way that algorithms are optimizing for that kind of thing.
Coming back though to GameStop, this is actually something that that I thought about and wrote about a little bit a few months ago, and that's around feelings of kind of disenfranchisement, that like people were just quite pissed at the establishment. And so when the establishment came along and was going to try and crush something that they loved, they responded in these seemingly irrational ways. But what they were doing wasn't about rationality. It's not about doing something irrational. It's about like passing a message. It's about telling someone how you feel through you know, a kind of otherwise non-meaningful action. Like, it's rare that an investment decision is seen so strongly as like a statement of our identity. But if you look at the discourse around GameStop and around, I think AMC theaters as well had kind of a similar effect around the same time. What you see there in the discourse is not so much a like, you should all pile in on this because we're all going to make a ton of money. It's, you should all pile in on this because the people we don't like said it's going to fail, and we're just going to give them a really big middle finger.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It probably plays into a little bit like the partisan world we're unfortunately part of, and maybe going to. But I remember hearing you know, and I don't follow the news too much, but you see, I mean, I follow it enough, but in that way where people are going on and they're like, I don't care if I lose it all. Like, that wasn't the point. And I was more under the impression that the point of investing was to actually generate gains. So it was a political, you know, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it just goes to show, like, you know, we typically tend to compartmentalize stuff and say like, this kind of activity is for this purpose and this kind of activity is for this purpose. But actually, like, it's a big mix going on all the time. Like, life is way more messy than the kind of compartmentalization that we want to kind of superimpose on top of it. So yeah, sure. Like, it's true that maximizing gains is something that's important to people in their investment decisions, but other things are important as well. And this is something I think we're seeing more and more now under like kind of less inflammatory auspices than GameStop, for instance, where, you know, people are thinking about the ESG commitments of companies that they're investing in, where they're thinking about the climate goals and thinking about divestment from fossil fuels and this kind of thing, where actually more and more, and I think especially with millennials and Gen Zs, the younger generations, there's more of an explicit desire to balance economic interests in investments with other kinds of interests like social and kind of cultural priorities that one holds.
Yeah, no question about it. And we actually have a sleeve of ESG models, and we always think of it as a filter, right? Because sometimes if you're going in there you're investing in less of the market until government comes out with regulation, which makes companies pay for maybe ways they're ruining the world. They're getting a product for free, actually, right? And so ultimately, you're going into ESG just to be a better person, where you're not maximizing wealth, which is fine. And we just want people to understand that this isn't like some thematic where we're going to outperform by doing it. You might, but that's really not the reason to go in. So stepping back to that, you know, in terms of algos and this concept of free. What are some tools people can use to kind of circumvent some of the innate biases that make us all act like that?
Right. So the most powerful thing by far is choosing your platform. And so I think, you know, you mentioned that like we kind of have this aversion to paying for things. Like, even paying a small amount seems like a massive leap from something being actually free. There's a lot of research about this, about like the kind of special status that free has. Like, the difference between costing $1 and costing $16 is not the same as the difference between costing $15 and being free, even though it's still like, it's just a $15 gap shifted, you know, one unit to the left or the right. But like, the difference between $15 and free is just qualitatively so not comparable to the difference between $1 and $16 in terms of cost. But from a purely economic perspective, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So asking yourself, first of all, like, if it's free, what are the things, like, how is this company going to make money? This company that's providing a service to me, how is it that they're going to make money from my interaction or my engagement with their product? And what kind of potentially perverse incentives is that going to introduce into the ecosystem? And what would I be willing to pay to avoid those perverse incentives? Or how much might it cost me to be getting, let's say, automated trade advice that doesn't prioritize my investment outcomes or my kind of social goals as well? Like those are not highest in the pecking order necessarily for a company that's offering me a product or a service for free. That applies as much with a digital application as it does with a human financial planner, by the way. When you're working with a planner who is employed by a bank or employed by an insurance company, like if that financial planning engagement is being offered to you for free, well, somebody's got to be paying the bills. That money's got to be coming from somewhere. Right. And the chances are very likely that they're hoping that it's going to come from you. And so the suggestions that they're going to make, I mean, it's very hard to strain out bias once it's in, kind of already seeped into the ecosystem. The best way is to create or find yourself in an ecosystem that is more healthy. There are some things that we can do ourselves. We can frame questions in various kinds of ways, and maybe that's something we can come to in a moment. But like, really, I want to urge that the ecosystem design, like your decision environment, is going to have a massive influence on the way that you make those decisions. And so the kind of concierge function, or like, can't find the word that I'm looking for there, but kind of the janitorial function of like tidying up your ecosystem, that is the first thing to do. And so if you are finding yourself in an ecosystem that's really messy, where your attention is being pulled by lots of bells and whistles and lights, and you're not paying for that, like, just ask yourself whether paying a few bucks a month might actually be much more worthwhile for you, because in the long run, getting better advice is much more economically worthwhile than getting the advice for free, but the advice not being as good.
Yeah, no, that's a great comment, and we look at it. It's really interesting. You had an adage before, and the second you said it, and I already forgot the full adage, but it's basically what I'll tone it down to. Just sometimes being a cards player is like, if you don't know who the mark is, it's you, right? So
yeah.
You sit down at a table. There's 8 other players, and you're trying to figure out like who's the sucker here. And if you can't figure that out, it's most likely you. And one approach may be as simple as just questioning, why is this free, right? If you go into Robinhood, like, why is this free? And we get it, by the way. I mean, asset management, it's huge. We sit in a great spot, right? We're independent, right? We're an RIA. So we get to pull on everybody else's research. We get to speak to everyone, and we're constantly getting offers of free things. And it usually comes with a nudge of, well, let me tell you how our product could really solve your problem. And then right there has to be some degree of skepticism, right? Because if their product's replacing something else, well, were they biased in deciding that product wasn't good, right? But it's the only way it worked. Like, why would they give it to you? Like, so I think you constantly have to think about, why is someone giving it to me for free? Maybe it's a really jaded, skeptical way of looking at life, but free sounds like, if it's not it's not a charity, I don't understand it. These are for-profit capitalists, so maybe that's where you start. I don't know.
And there are examples where stuff is given to you for free because someone else whose best interests align with yours is paying for it. So for instance, some of the projects that we're working on, as a social enterprise, like all of our projects have a social good kind of angle to them. One of the projects that we're working on is a tech development piece that is free to users because it's paid for by employee benefits programs. And like, what the employee benefits program aims to maximize is the well-being of the employees, because they know that well-being leads to greater productivity. So sometimes when you start to pull the thread, you realize that there's nothing untoward going on under the hood. But until you pull the thread and until you find out, you really don't know. And even in some instances where it seems obvious, you can pull the thread and things can be less obvious than that. Like, there would be one way for us to take these kinds of projects around, like an employee benefit program, for instance, and like turn it in a not so healthy direction, where in fact what we would be providing is like kind of information about when should employees kind of be moved along from their current job, right? So there's some writing about like Amazon basically burning through employees after about a 3-year period, specifically those people working in fulfillment centers, right? How is it that they figured out that 3 years was like the optimal moment? Somewhere there was some data being collected that demonstrated that. That's the kind of data that an employee benefits program has a lot of access to. So like, there are good stories to tell. And that's the kind of stuff that we're working to build. But like, you kind of have to be cautious all the way along the way. It's easy for things to just kind of like topple over into what seems like potentially a good idea, but then once you've gotten down that path a certain ways, you realize like, oh, we've kind of gotten ourselves into a tough spot here. So like being critical and being reflective all the way along the journey is the solution, and that's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, no question about it. And I wonder, like in the benefits program, right? If it's a positive, they may actually put that out as a disclosure, right? Because it's a pretty positive story, right? So you don't have to pull the thread as much as you might when you go on Google search and everything's for free, and you're like, okay, this is cool, as long as you don't mind everybody knowing everything about you. So that's that. So I want to go to a next topic, which is really this innate competence that we have as humans. And I think sometimes it's I'll give a story because it's almost like, so the other day, and this struck me, this was a really interesting one for me, at least. I was playing, I have 3 kids, my youngest is 7. I was playing a card game with her, and the card game had, the back was empty, it was blank. The front, the one that faced one of the participants, had a picture of an animal, and there were 3 descriptions of the animal, and you gave the other person 2 of the 3 descriptions. And then there were clues that they could give, and then it's like a yes or no, kind of game, and they try to guess it. And every single card I picked up, it was like, wow, this is so obvious. And she felt the same way with me. Like, she'd ask me, like, Dad, how aren't you getting it? Like, I had one, it was like, I don't know, long legs, really quick. I was like, ostrich, obviously. I don't know how anybody else would get ostrich off what I just said. I had to think about it a little bit. So I'm just wondering about that, like, bias, where it's just like, it's obvious, but
Yeah. So let's unpack a little bit there. So first of all, like, overconfidence is a big problem. The other is confirmation bias and like motivated information search. So in an ideal world where we were all just like extremely good at seeking and consolidating information, what we would do is form a hypothesis about, based on the information we have, we'd form a hypothesis and then say, okay, what's the shortest path between where I am now and figuring out whether my hypothesis is false, not figuring out whether it's true. The challenge is that in real life, we go down that second path. We say, like, what are all the things that I can do to make sure that my idea is correct? We don't try to invalidate our ideas. What we do is, like, we build up this kind of business case in our mind that makes it like so obvious to us and makes it like so clear cut. What we're trying to do is minimize ambiguity. Like, that's what our brain does best. It doesn't actually seek the truth all that effectively. We need lots of kind of undergirding to help our brains get to figuring out things that are true. Figuring out things that are consistent and unambiguous, we do super well. We don't need any help doing that. So one of the challenges then in terms of making an investment decision is, like, you get this idea in your head that maybe buying this thing is a good idea. And then you go out and say, well, I wonder whether it's a good idea. So you start to collect all the information that shows you that it is. You go and, like, you will reinforce your own perspective until you get to that point where you're comfortable telling yourself, like, yeah, it's a slam dunk. Like, I'm definitely going to buy this thing. That's the first thing that should set alarm bells off in your head. Because if it is so obvious, it should be that obvious to everybody. And if it's that obvious to everybody, whatever kind of upside you anticipate is already priced in. Because we're not buying, like, the price of an asset is not about how much additional value it's going to create. It's about what you're going to be able to sell the asset for in future. you are making a speculation about what people will do further down the line. So the question you should be asking yourself is not, is it so obvious that this company is going to be creating more value in the future? The question is more, do I have a reason to believe strongly that I can know that this company is going to create value before others know? So that's really like, I talked about this kind of custodial function of like tidying up your decision environment. The best way to make smarter decisions is to ask smarter questions. So the question you need to be asking yourself is, why would I know something? Or like, what is it that I know that everyone else hasn't figured out yet that gives me an advantage in buying this thing and being able to capitalize on that spread?
Yeah, that's a really good one. And when you look, you go even into investments, right? And you look and you say, hey, this person has a clear lead, and sometimes things, more well-known entities may trade at a premium just because there's more retail that just knows about it. The other part of the equation is just the valuation, right? And that's where I think a lot of people really got caught up in .com, right? They started doing the math and they said like, well, pets.com, there's 3 billion pets in this world. Like, they got to do well. And, there's some different stories going on there with funding and all sorts of other stuff, but it got totally disconnected from, we went down this rabbit hole of how big everything could be, but even beyond that, it got disconnected. The valuation part's always like a much harder conversation to be had, which is really interesting. So what's some ways to circumvent? What's some solutions there to assist in not getting caught up?
Yeah. So the first thing is asking that different question, like pivoting to a smarter question. The second is something called a pre-mortem. So this is something that's really effective in getting over pre-mortem. So most people are familiar with a post-mortem. Yeah. A post-mortem is like, okay, we bought this thing and then it absolutely tanked. And then we held on to it because we were like just kind of taking any chance that we could that we would recover some of our assets, and it just kept tanking. And then eventually everyone just kind of turned their head the other way, pretended it wasn't happening, and we sold this thing, and just like no one talks about it. But it's time to talk about it, right? That's the post-mortem. It's like, let's sit down and figure out, how did we come to the agreement that this thing was a good idea to buy in the first place? How did we somehow let this odious elephant in the room just continue to persist without ever saying like, are we going to sell this thing already and like cut our losses? That's a post-mortem. A pre-mortem is doing that, but before anything bad ever happens. A pre-mortem works like this. So I've got this idea. I'm going to buy this asset. I'm going to buy part of this company. And now I'm going to imagine like it's 6 months down the road, and that decision has gone really badly. The company has really struggled to bring a new product to market or whatever it is, and like the share price is really low, and I haven't managed to get out in time. Like, you kind of describe what that bad situation is to yourself. You can do it in groups as well. It's actually extremely effective to do it in small groups of 3 to 4. So you come up with these scenarios of like all the ways, like all the kind of possible dystopian futures you can come up with. Then you can do like a really rough and ready sorting there, just like arrange these. So, if you have 5 of them, write them down, 1 each on a card, and take those 5 cards and arrange them in order of like, this is the most likely to the least likely thing we think is going to happen. And then you can do the same thing of like, this is the most severe versus the least severe. And then you just take the product of those 2 things. So like if something is, ranked 1 as like most likely and 3 as most severe, then like that's going to have a 3 total and this kind of thing. And then you say like, all right, for each of these things, let's articulate like, if I had only known 6 months ago in the present moment that this thing was gonna, like, that this thing could happen, what would I have been watching for to know like, okay, now like there's a real risk that's starting to crystallize here. It's time for me to bail. And what that helps you to do is to identify what evidence you actually should be paying attention to in your investment decision. That's what helps you to go out into the world and find information that can potentially invalidate your initial hypothesis that this is a good buy. it will help you to get around that very natural tendency to just go out and confirm your initial belief.
Yeah, I really like that. That's a really good one, the pre-mortem. I don't think I've ever heard that. I wrote it down. I don't think I've heard that word before, but it's exactly right. Like, what's your worst case? And, what are the odds of it? And it's probably, it works exactly like a post-mortem. So it's probably a really good practice to do post-mortems as well, right? Because then what you end up, if you could actually match the two, it's amazing, right? Because then you take your pre-mortem, you start doing them, you have a post-mortem, you see where it comes. And I think sometimes people have, I notice this a lot, it's probably because we're all inherently a little selfish. I get to say that, I have kids. But they tend to statistically base their statistics based on an outcome that happened within their grouping, right? And so someone gets sick, God forbid they have cancer, and they beat it, and they did something. It's like, oh, well, you could beat that cancer. There's unfortunately lots and lots of people who might have gotten that and might not have gotten as lucky, right? There's a statistic there. It might be hard to find, but I find people do that, right?
Yeah. There's a whole cluster of biases around there. So there's like the representativeness heuristic, there's like recency bias, all that stuff that like just makes stuff more salient. So for instance, if you ask people like, how often do you think sharks are attacked by humans on any given day? They'll tell you 1% or something like this, which, by the way,
humans
whatever
sharks,
you ask them,
right?
humans being attacked by sharks.
There you go.
People will systematically overestimate that, by the way, because it's just like, it's a very kind of violent image that they have in their mind. The salience is very intense. So like they overestimate how often that happens. But if you ask them, kind of within a week after like some very gruesome shark attack has been reported in the news, you'll see that like the reported kind of anticipation of how often that kind of thing happens will spike. And then it eventually kind of tails off again. It's like right after the news breaks, it's like, oh my gosh, sharks are attacking people all the time. And then, it kind of tails off as like the memory of that news report tails off. So that's one thing. The representativeness heuristic is something else. So that's more like, if I told you about this person, Jane, like, she's very quiet. She likes to read. She studied literature in school, and she has 3 cats. And then I asked you, like, is it more likely that Jane works in a bank or works in a library? What would you tell me?
You go library, right?
That's right. And I mean, there's a certain logic to that. Like the descriptors that I've given are probably more characteristic of like our archetype of what we think someone who works in a library looks like. The challenge is there are just so many more people who work in banks than who work in libraries. Like if you didn't know anything about Jane and I asked you, is it more likely she works in a bank or a library? The answer you should give is that she works in a bank, right? So rather than like starting with this kind of mental model in our minds and asking like, how much does this description match this archetype in my mind? You should start with the base rate. So like, how many more people are there working in banks than working in libraries? And then for each of those characteristics that I give you, like she wears glasses, she reads a lot, has cats. It's like, how many times more likely do you think that makes it that she works in one versus the other? And like, is that enough to overcome this massive discrepancy? At a certain point, it's like, what you're committing yourself to in statistical terms behind the scenes of like the question that I just asked is you're telling me that like in virtue of these 3 features, like it increases her likelihood 100-fold or some absurd number of being a librarian versus being like some bank employee. So starting from those base rates and then adjusting our estimates from there is a really great way to avoid what's called the representativeness heuristic, or sometimes known as base rate neglect.
Got you. Very cool. So I'm going to do a share screen for a minute. Let's see how successful I am here. There we go. Not easy. We're going into the next topic here. And let's see if I could get, there we go. All right. So this is the S&P 500 in blue. We're not switching the topic. We're staying in cognitive biases. We're just going to touch on the charts for a second here. So S&P 500 in blue. TLT is the 20-year treasury. That is a risk-free rate a risk-free product, quote unquote risk-free. It's issued by the government, the US government. If it's not risk-free, we're all in a lot of trouble. So let's presume that's the case. Right here, what you have is the orange line actually outperforming over this 18-year period dramatically via the S&P. And obviously right at the end, this is right going into COVID, right? But you have an outperformance here, right? And so, the statement
outperforms
here, go ahead.
you're selecting your data way too cutely here. Like, what I look at this and I say it's not outperforming. It's basically performing exactly the same way, except for that very end point, which is extremely salient to us right now. Like, we're still living through what we hope is the tail end of this pandemic. And it's just like, it occupies our mind so massively. But if you look at like 2009, for instance, so if we cut this data differently, if we said, let's look from like 2010 until 2018, the answer is not that the S&P is outperformed by treasury bonds. The answer is that the treasury bonds are outperformed by the S&P. So like, you have to be really careful about which section of the data you're looking at. And this is, coming back to my point about confirmation bias, it's like, if you really have a strong kind of pet theory about what you are sure is right, like, you can go and find the data to support it. There's data to support anything if you're like willing enough to just disregard stuff that's clearly relevant.
Yeah, no, that's great, Brooke. And, it's always great to have the expert on, right? When you show a chart like this, one of the elements of it, and one of the reasons I picked a period which is so, so biased in one direction, is because this is what the industry does. And it's not only I say the industry, the asset management industry, it's really every industry, right? But when you think about investments, it's all about time frame, right? And you could always tell a good picture. And so here's one really amazing picture, and you very accurately pointed out, right? Because right now I could show you this picture. I could say, treasury and bonds give ballast to a portfolio, and they obviously give amazing returns, right? And then I go here, and I have kind of two of these. You could see here, okay, listen, since COVID occurred, it's underperformed a little bit, right? It's underperformed a little bit.
Yeah.
This is the same exact information. It's just on a chart which has a different axis on the left-hand side.
You've truncated the axis. Yeah.
So I truncated it just to show that it's kind of flat. And this one is bigger, so it just shows more movement. So this is anchoring, and I'm just kind of curious to your thoughts in terms of, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I won't pull it up on my phone and show you right now, but I was really struck by something that I looked at recently. I was checking out the caseloads in Canada on a news site, and it was really interesting to see the different impression that I got looking at the data with my phone oriented like this and having it shoved into the narrow space versus inverting my phone and having it spread over a wider space. Like, that's not even about axes being truncated. It's just about how much visual space they occupy. And it tells a completely different story.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And so, you kind of pulled right away, obviously, on time frames. And I don't know if time scales, it's something you threw out. I don't know if you don't mind defining it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I won't define timescales, but I will talk about the fact that, so, I mentioned earlier that like the best thing to do in terms of improving your decision making is just like kind of this decision hygiene of like putting yourself into an ecosystem where like fewer hurdles are in your path, and then kind of that just decreases the amount of like very difficult like cognitive work you need to do to stop yourself from doing all the things that are totally natural and automatic for you to do, and just say like, well, hold on. What I just did is the evidence of the fact that like I work in a place where I'm expecting to be tricked basically all the time.
So do I, by the way.
So
keep on going.
Yeah. I mean, timescales are a huge one there. It's like when I go and look at the timescales for my own investments, initially what I'm setting the default view to, if I can, is 30 years. It's like I'm anticipating, a roughly 30-year time frame for my retirement investments. So like, why do I care about how much this asset has changed value over the last 24 hours? on an axis that's truncated to like this tiny part of the entire value of the asset, right? So when you start to see it, and when you put yourself in an ecosystem where like people are always kind of like poking you and prodding you and like and challenging these things and like trying to trip you up, it does train you to just be like much more skeptical of your own initial reactions. And that moment of skepticism, just that like that stutter step of like, I feel myself being pulled forward, but I'm aware that I feel that pull. I'm just like, hold on, why do I feel this way? That's incredibly valuable. And it seems like something so small, and it takes so much effort and so much time to curate that, just that moment of like stutter step, to not react immediately the way that you feel yourself pulled to react. Anyone who has like lived with a romantic partner and found, you know, some thing in the back of the fridge that was like broken or, you know, has gone bad or something like this for the nth time, it's like, you know, that feeling I'm talking about, that feeling in your gut that's just like, ugh, I want to say some snarky thing, right? But learning to not say the snarky thing is like, that's where the whole game is played out. And it turns out that's true for more than just like, you know, romantic partners that you live with. It's very true in so many different ways, and in the way that we choose our investments, and the way that we choose our you know, our coworkers, if we're hiring people, you know, all of those decisions are ones where like our gut is not going to really have any trouble putting some really coherent picture together about what we should do. But whether that's the right picture or not takes like a lot of investigation and unpacking. I do want to come back to timescales because there's a story that I wanted to share there. So I think we get so caught up with timescales that we're just kind of exposed to so often. An experiment that I've read about and I've always wanted to conduct, I was so jealous when I heard someone had already done it, was like, how do people's investment decisions change if the default view in their application or in their, you know, their web portal or whatever is changed from like the 1 week view to the 5-year view to the 25-year view? And the answer is people are much less responsive to short-term volatility when their default view is long time scales. They trade less often. They tend to like, you know, they stop trying to like maximize these kind of tiny gains on very short timeframes. The timeframes in which they think about their investments will be heavily influenced by the timeframes on which they look at their investments. And on the topic of timeframes, like it's something that I don't think we're all that exposed to, maybe because we just are taught history so badly in school, but like there are some instances in the human condition where we look at really long time scales. And one story that I wanted to share with you about that is about Cambridge University. So I don't even know whether this story is true, but frankly, it's so good, I've been telling it for years anyway. So at one point, one of the oldest buildings at Cambridge, which has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, you know, the roof had periodically needed to be, you know, fixed up, and, you know, they were having leaks, and then they would have the roof repaired and this kind of thing. And eventually, you know, the engineer came in and had a look at the beams that support the roof. And he said, well, you know, we've been changing the shingles and this kind of thing, but like over so much time, there has been like slow water permeation, and like these massive oak beams in the ceiling are starting to rot. So they're going to need to be replaced soon. And the dean says, oh, okay, no problem. And the engineer says, hold on, like, I haven't finished telling you what I have to tell you. The problem is we've been deforesting England for so long that there are not sufficiently large oak trees anymore to replace those beams. And the dean says, don't worry about it. When the building was designed 500 years ago, the architect said we should plant oak trees in like the back, you know, quad. So it's okay, they're there, they've been waiting for us. Like someone anticipated 500 years down the road, this is gonna be a problem, we should plant an oak tree. So don't get too caught up in like this very short-term mentality of like, what are my gains today versus tomorrow? For the vast majority of what it is that we're doing in terms of investments, we're playing a much longer game than that. So, you know, you don't necessarily need to be investing for 500 years. Though I will note along the way that if we'd been thinking about that during the Industrial Revolution, we might not be having the kinds of energy crisis pains that we're having now. But just don't get so caught up in the short term. And if you need a little story like planting oak trees for 500 years worth of roofing to get yourself into the mindset of like, okay, the here and now is just really small compared to what's going on out there, then tell yourself that story. Put together like a library of those stories and have it on shuffle on your iPhone so that one will kind of randomly crop up as you're walking to your desk in the morning. And that'll get you into the mindset of not thinking so much about the short term. And in terms of like we were talking about Robinhood earlier, like tech design is an important part of this as well. Like you've probably been reading tons of ways to decrease the amount of interruptions and disruptions in your day, and essentially like the number one recommendation from everybody is turn off all of the bloody notifications on your phone. The same thing is true of whatever tech platform you're using to trade. Like if you want to get yourself into the mindset of thinking about 30-year investments, set all of your defaults to make that the ecosystem that you naturally walk into every time you sit down.
Yeah, that's it. That's a great comment. I want to expound on it for a minute. I think it's probably a really good time to to see if there's any questions from the crowd and finish up here. I do like that story. I might borrow it from you. The short time frame. And sorry, I'm stumbling on my words right now because I don't even know where. But one of the things I think about a lot, right? We just had a part of the graphic I showed. We had a 40-year bull market in bonds, and so you have that recency. You have all these elements where, and I think part of it, by the way, Brooke, is just the data, right? The data from the last 10, 15 years is incredible. The data from the 70s and 80s, I mean, they just don't have that sort of data. It's really hard. A great book that I'd recommend to everybody out there is a book called The Silk Road by Frank Copian. It talks about the economy around the Silk Road over the last 2,000-3,000 years. And that's what we always try to think about here too. It's like interest rates relative to the last 10 years, the last 40 years, the last, 1,000 years. There's that data. It's just a little tougher to get to. So I think that's a nice place to end. We have one question that came in. If companies' goals are to make money and people have biases that create algorithms that take advantage of it, like excitable content, how do we actually get out of this quagmire? That's a great question. So I think there's two ways to take it. I'm just curious, Brooke, for your opinion of how we do get out of that quagmire from like a bigger picture standpoint. I think you already gave us a thought or two of how to deal with it on an individual standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, at the systemic level, there's been a lot of discussion lately of shifting from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, and actually building in incentives for people to, for companies to maximize value along multiple dimensions. One of the challenges that we faced is that like shareholder value, shareholder primacy, and especially like shareholder value for the next quarter has become so like uncritically adopted as the way that businesses must be run, that other incentives just dropped so far off other priorities, other value, other types of value that a company might create have dropped so far down the priority ladder that they're basically not there anymore. So we need to find ways to actually bring those back. Part of that has to do with corporate structure at a macro level. I mean, there are individual level things that we can do around, the way that the ESG is reported, for instance, even just standardizing ESG reporting to make it easier to compare information across different sources will improve the ability of investors to actually consider ESG in the decisions that they're making. When you have like apples to oranges comparisons, you just don't make as good decisions. So those are some examples.
That's a good one. And ESG is a really interesting one because I think a lot of the data out there is self-assessed. right? Meaning where companies actually answer ESG information to get to the characteristics. Here, I think this is okay. Regarding timescale, it is important for advisors not to show year-to-date returns on performance reports instead of rolling time periods. Yeah, no question. I'm not sure if that's a question or comment, but it's exactly right. It's really interesting that, you know, you get that anchoring, right? We spoke a touch about anchoring. I don't know if we gave too many.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll end this.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. This other question is where I want to end this. So, you know, maybe, you know, so anchoring, right? So my attempt at putting up that slide is that initial impression, right? You get that initial impression and you're like, okay. And if you think about it, most people, when they look at returns, they look at year-to-date returns. They look at what did this product do from January 1st to December 31st. And if you get a really good print on December 31st, you're good. If you had great performance, but are happy, you know, so it's really interesting, and maybe some tips of how to, you know, maybe that's a good way to end it, of tips to work away anchoring that first impression, positive or negative, and just kind of move on. Yeah.
So someone mentioned rolling time periods. I think that there's a kernel of wisdom that we really want to plant and let flower there. Essentially, the way to, or a way that you can minimize the kind of impact of an initial impression is to give kind of multiple first impressions, to say like, all of these things are equally true of this thing that I'm showing you. There's a great example, one of the examples of investor humility that has stuck in my mind for years. There was some investor who had like beat the market for, I don't know, 10 straight years or something like this. Someone who's not Warren Buffett, because I mean, that's the whole other level, right? But someone had beat the market consistently for like 10 straight years. And when being interviewed by this, he said, that's only if you look January to December. If you looked like September to August, I would have beaten the market 1 year or maybe 2 in that span. And that to me, I mean, first of all, the display of humility was just like awesome. That kind of like self-awareness and confidence to just be able to say like, yeah, don't overplay this thing that, you know, you're clearly teeing up to overplay. That was wonderful to see. But there's a grain of wisdom in there. Like if he said, listen, you know, I've beat the market 10 years in a row if you look January to December, but also like if we did all 12 different permutations of when to start and end the year, what would that distribution look like? How many times did I beat the market in these rolling windows? Like that is actually a much more honest view of how that investor has performed over that time period. So that's something that you can do. You can say like, okay, well, here's the year to date. And I know that, you know, there are some stats that are just easier to pull on than others, but some of this just takes, you know, a bit of digging to say like, okay, well, here's the print on December 31st. And like, if we had taken November 30th and October 31st and these kinds of things, like, this is what it would have looked like for that, you know, for this set of 12-month periods. How well did it perform? And that's a much more telling way to communicate the performance of an investment than to just give this like one number answer. The one number answer is very attractive. It's attractive because it's easy. And so there's a piece here around like working with your client and educating your client, sensitizing your client to the kinds of information they should be paying attention to, so that you're in a position where you can sit down and have a constructive conversation about something a little bit more complex. And similarly, you're not going to get a phone call in your office when they walk by the bus stop and they see this ad that says like, oh my gosh, you know, this mutual fund just had like 30% over the last 12 months. Like, why am I not pouring all of my money into that? Because they will have developed a little bit more kind of like critical literacy around data.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Thank you very much, Brooke. I'm going to put up, let's see how, there we go. The thank you for joining us. So Brooke, thank you. I really appreciated our conversation. Thank you everybody who attended today's webinar, and wishing you all a great day.
Thanks for having me, and take care, everybody.